I'm going to do my best.
Good evening and welcome to the February 1st meeting of the Planning Policy Commission. Tonight we're going to talk about small cell wireless communications facilities, basically in Issaquah. But first, we have two minutes for the meeting of January 10th and 11th to have approved. We're going to do them individually. So can I have a motion to approve the minutes for January 10th?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
The minutes of January 11th, may I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Motion carries. So with that, we're going to open up to Keith and see what we have on tap on small cell communications.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So when they say what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, not true. I brought a cold back. I'm going to whine about it all night. So I'm going to try and be to the point when I can be. I am on cold medicine, so I may not have brought my A game. So again, we're going to kind of go through the presentation we went through last time. We're dealing with the major carriers, the major four carriers. Comcast, I think we threw into the mix. There may be others that come. They're all wanting to add small cell antennas. It's not a coverage issue, really. So the coverage, probably most of you haven't remembered the last time that you had a wireless call drop. I can't. So they're all doing a great job providing coverage through the metro area. This is more of a capacity issue. So now that we've all decided we want to stream Netflix on our phones and do things of that sort, it's providing more capacity for the system that's in place right now. And as we increase population in our area, the demand on the system is it's overwhelming the system. So there needs to be more infrastructure built, and we actually think that's a good thing. So really now, we have had our first application from Verizon get approved prior to the code revisions being put in place. It's on Issaquah, Falls City, Issaquah, Pine Lake Road. They're going to put some small cell antennas on top of some existing Puget Sound Energy power poles. The point is we need to get this revised code adopted before we get kind of an avalanche of more applications in. So the original 1807-505 was created for the macro cells, and those towers are located throughout the city. There's different places, water reservoirs, there's a couple in Central Park. But because of the way that they work, they're set up much higher than the small cell, and so their frequency of infrastructure is, the spacing can be much farther apart. But what we're talking about with these new smaller cells, and I gave you a little sketch here, so we could be talking about antennas on top of buildings or on the sides of buildings. We could be talking about antennas within the right-of-way, either on brand new poles or on existing light standards. And then public property, city parks, other publicly owned property. So really these things could locate anywhere, as long as they work primarily on line of sight. So part of it is, they need to kind of set up kind of a stream for them to work off of. So these are some just images of antennas. These ones here are small cell. They come in kind of different configurations. Sometimes they're put in a housing at the top of the light standard. And then these boxes are, and I shouldn't be talking about this because I'm not an expert. Those folks in the audience will be able to explain way better than I can. Those are kind of the antenna goes to like our other equipment that needs to then kind of do whatever it does. All right, I'm going to keep moving. So part of what we have in town is, and this is why every city's kind of regulations are a little bit different. I was going to leave the names off and let you guys guess where these are, but that might have taken all night. So, we have particular light standards in Tallis, and all the power's underground, and the Highlands similar. And so, if you're going to put a small cell network in our villages, either you're going to have to put an extension on top of this pole, or maybe it can go down somewhere, but these poles aren't that tall, and depending on the height that they want their antenna, most of the time they put them on an extension above. Now, some of our light standards, and this is Old Town and this is Squawk, in my opinion, and I said this last time, if you put an antenna up here on the top of this wooden pole, I'm not sure anybody's even going to notice. It's not the most aesthetic thing, so putting something on these, I'm not sure would be a major concern for us. So right now, if these are owned by PSE, they could go ahead and put antennas on top of these. But these ones, because they're decorative poles, they could not. That's the way the draft code is written. So what you guys wanted to see, I think, for the most part, was this slide. So this is, we got comments from the carriers, not Sprint. I don't know, they're not playing with us yet. But T-Mobile, Verizon, and AT&T. And we went through and kind of evaluated what they asked for. And this is a list of the things that we did change in the draft code, and these are the things that we kind of held our ground to. And I can either stop here, or we can go through these and kind of, I can give you a brief explanation of why we kind of did not agree with the suggested change. Your choice. Either one, we can talk through the no's, we can let them talk, we can talk amongst ourselves, whatever you want to do.
Well, it would be nice to get the cities,
Okay.
so why don't we just go down really
Sure.
quick?
Okay, so number one, there's kind of two parts to number one. Number one, we agree that it would be a lot of administrative work to do one permit for every new antenna. But then how many antennas are too many? And so it's trying to figure out kind of how many make sense as a bundle. And so we suggested 10. And given the fact that those poles are anywhere from like 300 to 500 to what we found in the last round of comments, maybe 1,000 feet, 10 times 1,000 feet, that's a mile. And so, having an application that spans a mile of street, that's a long way. And so we held it at 10 as opposed to increasing it to 20 or 25 because our city's kind of a small city. And there's just a scale issue for me personally that seems like, these things, I get doing it in bundles, but at some point you can do all of Gilman in one application. That seems like that might be too much.
We're just talking about getting permits.
This is getting permits.
Right, so, a carrier could come back and ask for another one.
Yes, so maybe Gilman's 2 applications instead of 1. So they can still, it's not saying they can't get the permits there, it just means they can't do it all as one potentially. Now the issue, and we were talking about it before the meeting, so what we tried to do in the code was say that you could have a certain number of antennas, up to 10, but it should be a contiguous application. They should be all connected somehow. And the problem was that contiguous ended up being a vague word. And so we stuck a number on it, which was 500 feet, which the carriers say, at least one carrier says, we're trying to actually have our spacing bigger than 500 feet to try and minimize the number of new poles that we might potentially have in your community. I like that, but now I have a problem with my definition of contiguous. So as we were talking before, and I'll leave this for you guys to think about, I don't think we have to answer this right now. We can let the carriers maybe think about it, is, I think what we could do is go ahead and leave the bundle at 10, but then get rid of the contiguous. So worst case scenario, an applicant comes in and they've got 2 poles on Maple and 3 poles in Tallis and, another 5 poles in the Highlands. You know what? If that's what they want to do, fine. I mean, I guess I'm not, we'll still review them. We'll review them under the same criteria. And as long as, the contiguous piece, again, because our city's not that big, I'm not that worried. If you guys want to drop the contiguous part of this, I think we could do that. I would rather do that than increase from 10 to 25, which was suggested by one of the applicants. City assignable co-location. This is the nut they hate. All right, so here's the deal. If they build a new pole in the right-of-way, let's say we're on Park Drive in the Highlands, and they can't be on the decorative poles, so they're going to put a new pole in. What we've said is we want that pole to be co-locatable, but we want the ability to give that right for co-location to another provider. The problem we're trying to solve here is we don't want, so let's assume that Verizon builds a pole, it's co-locatable, and T-Mobile comes in and wants to put an antenna on it, and Verizon tells T-Mobile, no, we think we're going to expand. We don't want to give you the right to co-locate on that pole. The city has no right or no ability to tell them they have to unless it's in code. And so this is one where there's technical reasons why they might not be able to co-locate. The city's not saying you have to co-locate. We just want the ability to allow for a co-location if it's possible technically. And because we're putting this in code, it gives us the ability to say, hey, Verizon, T-Mobile wants to go in this general area. Can they co-locate on pole number 12? And it puts us in a good negotiating position with Verizon, as opposed to telling T-Mobile, you know what, you got to go talk to Verizon and see if they'll let you co-locate on their pole. I can guarantee you they're going to come back and say, yeah, they told us no. So I'm sorry, I'm a pessimist, but this gets us in the kitchen and allows the city to be part of the conversation.
And Keith, that's just for poles that are in the right-of-way where we're saying, hey, you're taking our space, so we want to make sure that it's used to the highest public benefit.
Right, and one of the providers suggested that go into the franchise agreement. So for those of you, make sure you understand the mechanics here. If they're asking for a facility and it's in public right-of-way, they also have to get a franchise agreement. And so some of the requirements can be in the franchise agreement, and that's a different section of city code, and some of it can be in Chapter 18. The conversation we were having before the meeting was, I like it in 18 because in 18 now it's codified and it's clear. If it's the franchise agreements, although there's a structure to it, they all have to go through city council separately, and there's opportunities for negotiation that may, it leaves the predictability, I think, less for me. So I like it in 18. If we can all come to consensus on what it should say, putting in 18 and making it apply to everyone, I think is great. We have language in 18 that references the franchise agreement, and then in the franchise agreement, I'll make sure we have language that references 1807-505. But outside of right-of-way, if it's a if it's a public park, let's say, then there's a lease. So there's not a franchise agreement, but there's a lease because it's our property. So we would negotiate that, and that would be very different than the franchise agreement. And if it's private property, then they go and negotiate a lease agreement with the private property owner if they're going to put it on the building or on the roof. Okay. Front Street. So we still aren't feeling it for Front Street. So I did move Gilman over. I took it off the prohibited list. Right now, Gilman, we're going through a whole visioning exercise for Gilman. I don't know what that streetscape's going to look like. We may come back and edit 1807, 505 later after we know what Gilman looks like. But right now, and especially given just the variance in street light fixtures that we have on Gilman, that one was harder for me to really kind of stick with. So I was willing to give on Gilman, but not on Front Street.
What does that mean? They can't put any up on Front Street? Is that what you're saying?
So right now, Carl, so here's the light pole for Front Street, right? And, this is about, I think it's about 15 feet tall, okay? So their antennas want to be up here, okay? Up here, not down here. They want to be up here. So what we're saying is, and because of the character of Front Street, putting a bunch of new poles next to these poles that have antennas on them is going to be a character issue for Front Street. So what we're saying is no new poles in the right-of-way. It doesn't mean that they can't put antennas along Front Street, but they'd have to be either building mounted, either on the side or on the roofs. And yes, that limits what they can do. But right now, what I asked them to do, and they haven't done it yet, I think that they plan to maybe do that at some point, is to give us a rendering of what it would look like. If you're gonna turn this street lamp into something that's maybe this tall and has an antenna hidden inside it, okay. What's that going to look like? Is that going to be funky? Is it, how's it going to look with the other ones? Maybe nobody's going to notice. I don't know the answer to that. But rather than mess up Front Street, I think right now we're just saying you can't put a new pole on Front Street. So.
But you can on a building, on the side of a building, or on a roof or something. So you're not precluding them from putting antennas up on Front Street.
Nope.
Just on a new pole.
Just not a new pole. And right now, if they can convince Brett to be able to put them on municipal poles, you could put them potentially on a street light like at Front and Sunset. You could potentially put them maybe on top of the pedestrian poles for the rapid flashing beacons. So, I think there's choices there, but they've got to convince right now. Public Works Operations has said they do not want these things on their poles. They're worried about electrical issues, liability issues, and so they're going to have separate conversations with Public Works Operations and see if they can't move that needle a little bit. But for right now, they'd have to put them on buildings if they're going to put them on Front Street. So we changed, so number 4, we changed for no single-family zones for macro towers, and one of the carriers cried foul and said, but wait, we can do that now. And yes, they can. I think my question is, should they? Do you want your neighbor to put a macro tower in their backyard? And I think, it's one of those things that has happened in other communities. And right now, we're suggesting to remove the allowance for the single-family zone. They could put in a multifamily zone, but not single-family. So it does take a bunch of the city out of service in terms of new macro towers. But we think that, at least at this point, there's not really a demand that is unsatisfied, and I don't know. It just seemed like the right thing to do. But this is new ground. This is new territory, and I want to make sure you guys are clear on that.
So they can't put in a macro, but they can put in small cells.
In the right-of-way.
Okay.
And Keith, I'm thinking,
Single-family homes, small cells in a home.
So right now, I think, so we did not preclude it in single family. So if you wanted to, say, put a small cell on the side of somebody's house, you could do that. I don't know that they'd want to, but you could.
Well, isn't it under discouraged, or am I reading it incorrectly? Is
You're
property
gonna make-
allowing for residential use under discouraged?
You're going to make me look, aren't you? Let's see. So small cell, sorry for not knowing that off the top of my head.
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, so it's under the discouraged piece. So they'd have to show us how they couldn't make any of these work. And then yes, we would allow that.
so Keith, when we're talking about single-family zones, I'm thinking up in the Highlands, how we've got the water tower area next to the school.
Yeah.
How we've had some talks about putting something there. Would that be then precluded for the macro towers?
So so Central Park already has 2 macro towers in it. And it could still, because it's not zoned single family.
Got it.
It's zoned community facilities.
Yes.
Our favorite city zone. All right, keep going. So there was and this isn't really in your guys' wheelhouse, number 5, but I just did want to put it up here. So there was some concern over the fees. We talked about that a little bit last time. We already talked about no city-owned poles. They're going to make a run at Public Works Operations on that, and I told them that's fine. One of the carriers, AT&T, asked for us to change the definition for small cell and referenced a different section of city code, and I don't know, I didn't see the benefit to that, so I left it the way it was. So now we're down into some minutia stuff. There was some other edits that AT&T asked for in 060C, which didn't agree to those either. I think I was putting my foot down. Conversation about pre-apps. Right now, what we're saying is you need to have a pre-app. And one of the carriers said, well, pre-apps are only required for level 2 in the IMC. And that's true, but in Central Issaquah, they're actually required, period. So because this code's going to be citywide, we figured we'd take the highest bar, which actually is Central Issaquah, not IMC. It's the confusion that we have like city code that doesn't apply to certain parts of the city. So, and really the pre-app isn't intended to be anything other than an opportunity for staff and the applicant to talk about the application that's coming in so that we can understand what they're proposing and see if there's any quick things that we can address so that maybe when they do bring their application in, it actually leads to more streamlined processing on our part. So we see it as actually being positive. Number 10, T-Mobile asked for us to add a definition for unified camouflage. It seems to be a T-Mobile specific term, which seemed like I didn't want to put it in the definition section since it was just relating to one carrier, and maybe I don't understand, but it seemed like that's their coined phrase. So I did not do that. And then the figure 1, there was concern over our figure 1, which is the kind of the illustration of a pole that we would accept. And the intent is, again, it says, or is otherwise approved by the designated official. So it gives them one example that they should know that they should be able to get permitted. But like, for example, T-Mobile says, well, our poles look way better than that. Well, great. Then that shouldn't be a problem, should it? So it's not intending to say it has to look like that pole, but it's saying that there's at least one example that'll get you through a permit. But if you've got a different pole that looks better than that, then I would hope you'd want to bring it. We're not trying to dumb down the look of these things by any means, but it seemed like giving a visual example was a good choice. So that's, there's some other little things. I went through all of their second round of letters today. I think I captured most of it. I did go into the draft code and did some of the edits that were suggested, but again, they were definitional things. There were some suggestions on how to make different paragraphs read better. So some of those things I did go ahead and do, and that would be the version of the code I'd want you guys to approve if you get that far tonight. So that's my list of yeses and nos.
Can I ask one clarification on the Front Street? So there is now the wording "new pole" added to prohibited?
So the issue that one of the carriers brought up last time was because we have a zero setback on Front Street for buildings, right? So if you put an antenna on the side of a building, it's actually overhanging the right-of-way. So the reason why I put new pole is to allow for that structure-mounted antenna to actually overhang the right-of-way, which would be different than somebody putting it on a new pole.
So my concern, I guess, about that is that we have this example of these decorative poles, which we like the look of, and the example of extending that, which wouldn't be a new pole, it would be an extension. So I would ask that be clarified, that it's not only the new poles, but it's also the decorative poles that are prohibited.
That's here.
Municipal poles.
Municipal poles and decorative poles. So, I think, let me think about that a little bit, Vicki.
Okay.
About just
'Cause-
listing it as pole mounted rather than new pole.
Okay. Oh. That should be in track changes. I don't know why that didn't work. Show markup. Well, that looks a lot better. All right. Let me delete that. Okay. Any other things before you go to public comment?
No? We might want to come back to some of this stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Don't go away.
Absolutely. I'm here all night. I'll leave this one up just in case.
Okay. So with that, I'm going to open the public hearing at 7 o'clock. And the first thing I want to do is add into the public hearing verbal comments received on January 24th from Richard Bush, Linda White Atkins, Matt Russo, and Carol Tagayan? Tagayan? Pretty close. And with that, if Amy from AT&T would like to come up and speak.
Thank you for coming out tonight to hear about this, and thank you for all the time I can tell you put into this to educate everyone. It is a new technology, so it takes a bit to get informed about what's going on and how it impacts land use in the city of Issaquah. My name is Amy Pellegrini. I'm with the Wireless Policy Group representing AT&T. We're here tonight because AT&T is responding to the significant increase in the high demand for the wireless services it provides in the city of Issaquah. I would just like to highlight 3 main points that we would like to see modified in the proposed code changes. We would suggest that small cells are not prohibited from any location listed in the table in subsection 090.b in the draft that you have tonight. AT&T has gone through great lengths to have several cell designs blend into the existing environment so that the high demand can still benefit service while preserving the character of the existing environment. We would like the opportunity to work with staff on design criteria and design reviews so that we can meet the service demands in all areas. Further, as the owner of many poles, the city will be able to approve designs before allowing any installation. With this in mind, we would like to see the small cell location table be modified so that the prohibited column is eliminated or merged into discouraged. Secondly, we would like to address the elimination of the macro cells as prohibited in single family and duplex zones, which is a departure from the city's current code, as has been referenced tonight. We do think it is prudent to propose, we do not think it is prudent to propose any new changes to this section, which prohibits macro sites in any zone. As you mentioned before, there's different types of uses in a residential zone, and sometimes it can be more aesthetically pleasing to blend into a church steeple or something that's like on a water tower. I'm not sure if they're all public facilities and single-family zones. Yeah, we've had a site where the water tank was right between 3 homes, and that wasn't pleasant to look at, but someone's big, huge backyard where no one's going to see it, that went against a freeway, was where the actual residents decided to put it. So we just want to make sure that with the macro sites, there's full design review, and we just wouldn't want to limit any options there. Also, with regards to small cell siting and locations, we would like to see the alternative site analysis evaluate existing poles within 100 feet of the proposed new location. The small cell sites cover very targeted areas to meet high demand for capacity in the network and has limited ability to relocate to alternative sites. For example, an applicant for a new pole can show that no existing poles within 100 feet are feasible options. And we just want to thank you for this opportunity to share our comments, and we look forward to continue working with you. Thanks.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to speak?
Good evening, Chair Pavlov. My name is Kim Allen. I'm with the Wireless Policy Group too, but I'm here on behalf of Verizon Wireless this evening. Thank you very much for the opportunity to work with your staff and to hear from us tonight. We do appreciate the collaborative approach that's been taken to the code to date, and it is our goal to get a code that is efficient for us and which preserves and recognizes the community aesthetics here in the city of Issaquah. So that being said, we have looked at a number of the shifts that have gone on in the code, and really Verizon's just going to talk about 2 of them, I think, tonight. On the residential piece, though, if we could possibly have the opportunity to site towers on non-residential uses, such as church properties and that sort of thing, we tend to, that's where we drive our sites anyway. That would be the site of choice. Generally, we would not site on a single-family home in any way for a variety of reasons, not a tower and not a small cell. So, but we do want to preserve the opportunity to use non-residential uses that are present in residential districts to add another tower if necessary. As I think your planning director said, the population is increasing, the usage is increasing. You know, our cell phones now, which used to be in the glove box in case you broke down and needed to call somebody, are now the remote controls for our lives. More and more of the functions that we have are being shifted to wireless, from your home heating to alarm systems to insulin pumps that folks who are diabetic use. All of those things are making use of our wireless network, and that's where we're coming in to add capacity really throughout the entire region. With respect to the code, I think that Keith mentioned that one of the things that was difficult for us was in a batch of small cells, and I think Keith said 10. We did ask for 25. We can start with 10. That's all right. But to require that they be within 500 feet of the next one really defeats our purposes. Verizon has a 2-antenna configuration per pole and 2 different sizes of radios. The larger radios go a longer distance and allow us to use fewer poles in covering the area that we need to cover. And so to require us to put them within 500 feet of each other really minimizes the range that we have. We have range between 500 and 1,500 feet for some of these radios. And when we do that, we can use fewer poles and put fewer things in the right of way. So that's our goal, is to be as aesthetically minimal as we possibly can. So I agree with the solution that's being proposed, that just remove the 500-foot contiguous requirement and leave it at 10. I think Verizon would be fine with that. And we would also be able to deploy in the manner that we've designed so that we can minimize our impact on the right-of-way in Issaquah by using the strongest radios we can to get the biggest bang for our buck in our small cell network. As Keith said, the other issue that's really important to us is to eliminate the assignable right of co-location to be held by the city. These poles that Verizon or any carrier would place in the right-of-way, it's the city's choice that we would own those poles. You know, some jurisdictions require that you dedicate them to the city, and then they're under city ownership. The city can decide what to do with them. These poles would instead, the ownership would be retained by the carrier that builds it. And what we have proposed, rather than have an assignable right of co-location that the city holds, the city doesn't have the ability or the expertise to determine whether T-Mobile's antennas and equipment will be compatible with the antennas and equipment that Verizon has on the pole that they built. That's just beyond the scope of the city's expertise. And so to have the city choosing the carrier that's going to go on the pole without regard to the scientific analysis that goes into deciding whether co-location is possible on a pole, I think frankly, it exposes the city to some liability potentially and creates a very difficult problem for the carriers. I think that with macro sites, we're also required to build it big enough to co-locate on. And the code says that you should build it and you should allow co-location. And we would propose that this code say the same thing, that the carriers, either as a condition of the lease agreement that we would need to obtain to put a new pole in the right-of-way, or as part of the code that there be a condition of building a new pole would be that you would build it large enough for co-location and that you would allow co-location if technically feasible. That's the language that we're proposing that I think would compel us to do the right thing, although I think we do it anyway. And because frankly, a co-location offers a revenue stream, because that space that the second carrier would occupy would be rental to the carrier that built the pole. So there is an incentive to add a co-locator to your pole, certainly, but you want to make sure it's not going to interfere with the installation that you have for your customers on that pole. So that's what we propose, to just have an outright requirement in the code that we co-locate if technically feasible, just the same way we do it for macro sites. Now let me just check my notes and see if there's anything else on Keith's list. One of the things that we are going to try to talk to is the the municipally owned poles. We understand Public Works is not open to that at this time. We hope to change that. And just wanted to let you all know that in other cities around the Puget Sound region, Verizon has been working hand in glove with those cities to develop designs in historic districts and decorative areas of their cities where we design a pole that's acceptable for them. We have a pole that is that's designed that is almost ready to go in historic Spokane, with their acorn top lights with the swoopy arms that they're on, and we managed to design a pole that the city of Spokane thought was compatible with that very distinct historical design. In the city of Seattle, Verizon has designed a pole for Pioneer Square that passed muster for the Seattle Historical Commission. So we do have some great pole designers that are working right now to try to give us solutions in areas where cities have spent and invested and visioned a particular look for a portion of their city. So what we're asking is that rather than have it an outright prohibition, if we were to go on a municipally owned pole, if we were to ask that, we would need to get a lease from the city. It's entirely optional for the city to let us onto a municipally owned pole or not, or to place a new pole in one of these districts where you have decorative lights poles. So I guess we would ask that those be shifted into the discouraged column rather than outright prohibition, to give us a chance to show the city what we can do. And if the city says, no, that's just not good enough, that's fine. But we would like the chance to try, as we have in other cities, so that we can bring small cell technology and increase the data capacity and the number of users that can be on our network at one time. In areas historically where you have these decorative poles, there are areas where there's pretty high traffic. You have a lot of people, you have events, that sort of thing, and it is a place where small cells are needed. So rather than an outright prohibition, we're asking you to strongly discourage us unless we can show you otherwise, and give you an acceptable design. And with that, again, we would like to thank you very, very much for taking up this technical topic and helping us find a path forward in the city of Issaquah to bring this new technology and infrastructure to your citizens and your businesses and your visitors. And with that, I will be available all night for questions if there are any at the end of the meeting. Thank you.
Would anybody else like to speak?
Jennifer Taylor with Rika Consulting. I'm a site acquisition consultant for Verizon, and I'm actually the one working on the East Ridge project, which is the Issaquah, Pine Lake, Issaquah Falls City Road.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, sorry. So really the only item that Kim did a great job of running through everything already, but the only thing I wanted to speak to really was the limit on the 500-foot gap. The East Ridge project, the first one that we've just gone through City Council for our franchise, the smallest gap between the 7 nodes we have there is 590 feet. And the largest gap is about 1,000 feet. And that's simply due to the placement of the existing poles. And as Kim said, the type of radios that we're using that allow us to have that sort of distance. So that project alone would have to come in as 7 separate applications with the 500-foot limit. And I'm not sure that that's a benefit to the city to. Seems to me it would be nice to be able to review them all sort of in a batch and not necessarily have that separated just because of the distance. And it also, sometimes the distance can come up if we're trying to be selective about which poles we're using. We're trying to avoid going right in front of windows or homes. Sometimes we're looking for a little bit more less visible pole options, and it's nice to not have to be considering, is this going to cause a delay in our project because we're going to have multiple applications that'll take longer to get through. It's just another factor where it would be, seems a little bit simpler to treat it as one project the way that we are looking at it. That was all.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to speak? Would anybody else like to speak? With that, I will close the public hearing at 7:15 and open it up for discussion. Do any of you have additional questions?
I do. And I don't know, addressed to
I can go sit back down.
the service providers, and I don't necessarily care who.
Well, why don't you find out what the question is?
Yeah, before you volunteer, you may not want to step up.
Oh, I don't know, I think I will.
My question, the 500 feet seems to be a pretty reasonable thing to eliminate. My question is, how reasonable is 10 towers? If you're looking at a project to expand the service, what's the average number that you look at? Is it 1? Or is it 27? Or is it for the whole community? And that's what I'm not sure I understand. So if you're going to do we talked about Gilman, how long Gilman is. I don't know, a couple miles at most. If you want to put a tower every 500 feet or less than 500 feet, would you be looking at putting in a project that would be just for that one neighborhood, or would it be for the whole downtown area? I don't understand what the numbers are.
Sure. And Kim Allen from Verizon again, just for the record. We would typically, when the RF engineers go and take a look at what the need is and the capacity is, they kind of do it in a geographic area. They look at a neighborhood, a manageable chunk of a neighborhood, and then folks like Jenny go out and they have a map of that area, and they find where the poles, the RF engineers give an idea of where they need poles. Jenny goes out and she finds, are there poles there that we can use? Takes them back to the RF engineers who say, yes, these will allow us to fill the gap in capacity that we have in this area. Typically, what we have been seeing in other cities that have been adopting batching has been 20 to 25, or a lower number with an option for the director to approve up to 25 if it makes sense. Sometimes we batch them by pole types. If we have a larger section that has two types of poles, one has light standards and one has wood utility poles, we might batch the wood utility poles all together because they're all the same, and it makes it easy to review. And in that same larger geographic area, then batch the light standards because they're all the same. So there's a couple of ways to slice this, but typically the cities that are adopting new wireless ordinances now are settling right around the 20 to 25 is the number that we're seeing.
But you could live with 10.
If the 500 feet goes away, I think we could. At least to start. And, codes can be adjusted as this is a new technology and a new process for everyone. Each city is going to develop a process to do this batch review. And so it may make more sense to say 10 and up to a number at the discretion of the planning department. They may want to build that in so you don't have to go back for a code change, but you can keep it to 10 to start to make it manageable until you get your best practices in place for this.
Well, I just was curious, because if you have 10 and your engineer comes and tells you we can improve the system for, let's just pick Old Town as a location. Mm-hmm. We can improve it, but we need to put in 17.
Yeah.
Would the city then mandate with this proposal, they'd have to do 2 sets of permits?
Yes.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
I think it, so.
I mean, it does, because you get double fees, but does it?
No. So I think it does at the beginning. So part of it is there's going to be a huge learning curve for staff. And I think part of it for me, 10 seems like a manageable number to look at and look at the impact on the street. And, and especially if you're talking, if it's 500 feet, that's almost a mile. Right? That's almost a mile of street frontage that you're doing under one application. And so I think for me, the 10 number seems like a good starting spot. We may very well get to a point where we all think 10's ridiculous and it should be 15 or 20. But I think that could be a future iteration of the code once we have more proficiency in doing the permit review. I think part of what I'm worried about is because there's two pieces to this. One is you don't want to create a bunch of bureaucracy and a bunch of need for additional permits, but there's also this shot clock that I've also got to live with. So as soon as they bring an application in, it's ticking, and we have to actually perform and get it done by a certain amount of time. And so part of this, is we're going to be slower at the beginning as we learn. Planners are by nature timid about making mistakes because they tend to last for a long time. And so they're cautious, they're going to be slow. And so doing 10 seems like a good scale for me. And so I would advocate for leave it at 10, but like I said earlier, I think the contiguous piece, it seems, as we've talked about, it seems less relevant for me, and especially since our city is as small as it is.
I have a couple comments. One, I like 10, and I also like getting rid of the contiguous 500 feet, just for when we get to that point. The other one, Keith, this was about the macro sites in single family. There was a request to include macro sites on non-residential uses in single family zones. Is there a definition? Is there already a definition anywhere in code of non-residential use and what that would be?
So,
or would we be
yes.
creating a new?
No. So right now, those single-family zones identify, obviously they allow single-family houses.
Right.
But they also allow other things. And depending on what the zone is, it will tell you what you can and can't do there. Most of the things that we have, like water reservoirs, they would not be on a single-family zone. They would be on our favorite community facility zone. But I'm going to guess with you, and I'm going to phone a friend. I'm going to guess with you, most of those single-family zones do allow churches. So, if like a church parking lot is somewhere that they would want to put a macro tower, and we think that is the case, we could go back into the prohibited and put, single-family zones where single-family is the existing land use. So if it's a non-single-family use within a single-family zone, and there are a handful that are allowed in single-family that's not residential, that could happen. But, it could be like a bed and breakfast, right? We allow bed and breakfast in single family. I'm sorry, I could actually pull up the code and we could look at it. But there are some things that are allowed in single family zones that are not traditional single family. And so if we do allow macro towers in non-single family uses, you could be, okay, your neighbor now, if you were next to a bed and breakfast, all of a sudden it's like, well, there's a macro tower there. But maybe that's worst case scenario. And if you're next to a church, maybe that's fine, but a church with a macro tower maybe isn't as good. So maybe, I think we could probably, if there's an inclination from PPC to allow it in single family, in non-residential, we can talk about what kind of protection mechanisms we might want to maybe add to that.
I was just curious. I didn't want to create something that was overly complex, but I just had the question. And I'd be curious. I would be okay with that in non-residential uses because it's allowed now, trying to kind of split the difference. But I'd be curious what others have to think about that. The last thing I will say is I'm a little nervous about the city assignable co-location thing, only because the carriers retain ownership of the poles.
Okay, let me. I'm not tracking on the concern, and so let me explain the way it is in my head, and maybe you guys will go, oh, well, then maybe that's not a big deal. So I have a right? It doesn't mean that I'm going to make something happen that doesn't want to happen. It just means that, if they have a pole out there. And whether it's T-Mobile or Sprint or Comcast or somebody comes in and says, you know what, we want to put a pole right across the street from that, I can say, well, have you looked at that location and would that work for you? And then they might say, yeah, that would work. We'd have to put it here on the pole. And I'd say, okay, well, they have given us an assignable right. So I'm gonna say you should talk to them about leasing that space. Okay, it's no more than me connecting people together, right? Gotcha. But at the end of the day, if there's a technical reason why it doesn't work or a legal reason why it doesn't work, the city's not going to mandate it. You know, it's just, it gives us the ability to say, you should be able to talk to them, and you know, they should let you there if you want to be there. That's a different thing than putting it in code and saying, you know, it should be co-locatable and they should be able to talk to each other. You know, it gives us more leverage.
I had the question, the lady from Verizon raised the issue in regards to the difference between macro towers and these small cells. What assignability are given to macro towers? Is it different than what you're proposing for small cell?
Yes, it's more of an encouragement and not a requirement. And part of the reason why, you know, I'm suggesting we dial this in a little tighter is because of the number of poles we're talking about. And this is, again, I don't know that any of us know what this is going to ultimately look like, but if we have now 4 new sets of poles every 500 feet marching down Gilman because there's no co-location, that's one potential outcome. If I can half that, because now I've got 2 providers on each pole, is that better? The poles are bigger. So this is and Lindsay had sent a question in, and I think that, you know, it's a trade-off. The poles have to be bigger because you have a vertical separation on antennas. They're probably the diameter is going to be bigger to hold the additional electrical and, you know, hardware up, you know, and so, but the problem is, none of us know what this is going to look like. You know, we don't have a crystal ball, so we're trying to make some decisions to affect the outcome, I think, in the community's favor. And this one's, I think it's, nobody has a crystal ball. It's completely debatable. You guys might say, you know what, we should just take the smaller tower, the smaller poles, you know, maybe instead of 45 feet, maybe they're 30 feet or 25 feet now, but I've got more of them. Maybe that's better. It's a judgment thing. And I don't know that, you know, I don't know that any of us know at the end of the day what this is going to look like until we get there.
So on that line of thinking, I do have concerns with the idea of a 45-foot pole being added. What you've shown us there, if you're looking at the pictures of our poles, are, as you said, many of them are 15 or 20 feet. To be putting additional poles potentially every 500 feet that are 45 feet tall, that's concerning to me, you know? So are there any alternatives?
You know, I think what we know, is where there's a situation. Now, this guy on Gilman, I asked Lucy, how did this go in? This thing's huge. So I believe that the new street lights for Gilman, when they do the streetscape, are probably going to be black shoe boxes, but they're probably going to be down here around 15 to 18 feet, like most of our pedestrian scale lighting. This guy's a monster. You can put antennas on this thing and not have to extend it. But I don't think that is where we're going in terms of our future standards. And so your question, Lindsay, so if this thing is here and you have one of these guys down the street here, yes. So this is, you know, it's, I think we have to take a step backwards and say, this is a piece of infrastructure that our community wants. This is demand driven. I think the carriers would tell you that. And so what we're trying to do is figure out how do you put it in and try and preserve the aesthetics to the best of our ability. You know, if you could get co-location on a pole this tall and get 2 antennas on it, and then the street lights down here at half the size, and that happens every 500 feet, one on each side of the street, two carriers on one side, 2 carriers on the other. You know, I don't know that we know yet. I mean, I think the antennas need to be where they need to be, and they're either going to be on a pole or they're going to be on a building.
So my other concern is with buildings. There's a 15-foot height allowed for the building-mounted small cell antenna. When you're putting it on roofs and things like that, I would love to see a picture of what that would look like and what the requirements are for kind of camouflaging that, or any requirements for coverage.
So, so I couldn't tell if your concern was that 15 was too tall or 15 was not going to be tall enough.
Too tall.
Okay. So I think where we're headed for like central Issaquah is, you know, the height at which they're going to want to put their antennas are probably not going to be roof mounted. They're probably going to be side of building, because our hope is that most of our buildings are going to be, you know, 5 to 6 to 7 stories tall. I don't know what's happening on Cleveland Street, if they're actually putting any on side-mounted building antennas. If you want to, sure.
Fair disclosure, I just finished 11 years on the Redmond City Council. So I was deeply involved in planning our downtown renovation and renewal. And when the carriers went to the city of Redmond, they had an outright prohibition on small cells in the Cleveland, Redmond Way area where the big downtown park is developing, which didn't make sense because that's where all the people are. And that's where all the people are going to go. So they have decorative poles and actually some decorative lighting that's on the Cleveland streetscape. So we are permitted to get attached to buildings, marquee signs. We can attach to, I think Keith referenced the signs that have the flashing beacons for walk. We can integrate into those really, really well. In fact, I'm going to send Keith a deck of our ideas concept deck, because we can really integrate into all of that. And then there are some blank pole options, decorative blank poles that don't have a functionality like a light, but that are very decorative and very compatible with just about any decorative theme that you would have in the downtown. So we're looking at all those options. We look at parking lot lights as well. I think the important thing is that we have a path forward in these growing, cities where you're anticipating significant redevelopment. Attaching to the side of buildings is a little more problematic for us, because a small cell, generally, we want to get into those buildings with coverage, and if it's mounted on the outside, you lose a lot of that. And then you also lose the 360 piece of your directional antenna, because part of it is flush up against the building. So it is not one of our preferred locations. The reason why the pole option is so great is because you can point them everywhere, and you can shoot them right where the coverage needs are and the capacity needs are. But I know that the city of Redmond, rather than saying no way, said, come to us, we're going to do a robust design review, and ultimately, it's the city's call. If they don't like it, if we haven't met their bar, then we won't be able to go there.
So Keith, on that idea, sorry, I'm going to have to get up again. Regarding the decorative poles or any of the areas on Front Street or something like that, what do you think would be the best way to go forward on that? If we feel like they're going to be able to show us something that says they can probably meet our standards to create a new pole, would you rather say, yes, it's going to be up to, you guys to do the review, or would you rather potentially change the code later?
So with Front Street, so Front Street can be a little bit of a different animal to some extent, because we happen to be updating that sub-area plan, and it's going to have some code amendments later. So for me, because we haven't figured it out yet, rather than say, yes, you can do it, and here's the process, I'd rather say no and come back later and fix it, because that's just a code amendment. What we could do is we could put, if we would rather not just have prohibited next to Front Street, we could put as allowed by the Old Town sub-area plan. Because, what's going to happen, what we think is going to happen is when the Old Town update gets approved, which we're hoping is this year, the next step will be to do additional design code, similar to what we did with CIP. And so we've talked about having a consultant do that. So if they were ready at that time, and that's hopefully, like no wood to actually knock on. Oh, wait. My hope would be that maybe in 8 months, we might be ready to start talking design guidelines for Old Town. And if they're ready to show us what they think they can do on Front Street, we can always incorporate it into that specifically. So this code could reference that code, but that's just for Front Street. It happens to be for Old Town because we've got that in process. That is a convenient way to deal with that if you wanted to not just prohibit it outright now.
Good. Yeah. And then just the last thing I have listed here is someone mentioned something about the legal risk for the city.
Yes.
For co-location. Is that something that we've run past legal or that we're going to take through?
Legal's in the room. So if Daniel wants to talk about that, I'm more than happy to come sit back down.
Do you want just a microphone there?
No. This is the witness box.
I know.
I'm uncomfortable hearing it.
Well, my name's Daniel Kenny. I'm with Ogden Murphy, so I work with Jim Haney, if you've worked with him. And so Alana Zana, another attorney in my office, and myself have been working with Keith to do some review on this. And I think that and I wanted to jump to that section here real quick. I think co-location, I don't want to get into a legal analysis on the record here. There's more appropriate venue for that. We can provide you with resources and responses to that. I do think that we can do some fine tuning here. Definitely understand and appreciate where Keith is coming from in terms of what the goals are here. And I think there's a way to get there, whether it's this language or maybe a slight modification. I would note that on the small cell, the section B, it is encouraged to co-locate. So in order to get away from co-locating, they're going to have to show to the designated person that they can't do that co-location. And one would presume that that would be conversations with that other pole owner. And that pole, with the code that's written here, would have to be co-locatable. It has to be large enough so there's a spot that's there because it's a new pole that has that spot available on it. And that person has to go and talk to them in order to move out of the encouraged to get their own pole. So there are steps that Keith has built in here that are going to make it harder to not co-locate because of the way it's structured. But I do think that there should be some language, and the way that Keith is doing this is to make that as robust as we can do it. But I do think that there's some more conversation to be had here.
So maybe I'm off base, but I think what Lindsay is asking you in the way of legal is if putting the small cell on a pole that's owned by the city in the that's already there, is there a legal problem with the city if there's something happens to that pole or the...
Oh, I'm sorry. So maybe I misunderstood.
That wasn't what I was saying, but I think that's a valid question.
So the question that you have is whether or not putting small cell on a city-owned pole, allowing it on a city-owned pole, has legal risk.
Yeah.
Well, everything has legal risk, right?
That probably depends on how the lease is written.
Totally correct. So there will be a lease in place for access to that pole, and we would write into that lease everything that the city would want to protect its interests.
Anything else? I figured, but I wanted to get in the record.
Yes. So I had a question that was on the previous slide about the technical review, which was a change that was made. What do they have to show to demonstrate why they put a pole in a certain place? So if they wanted to put a pole right in front of somebody's house, what do they have to show to say that that's a reasonable place and that's the only place that they could put that pole?
So this is definitely not going to be my area of expertise. So we had drafted some language, and you can see it's all been struck through. Daniel has been working with at least one of the carriers to come up with an alternative. So right now what it says is network providers shall consider the established preferences and shall attempt to comply with as many encouraged criteria as possible. Discouraged locations may only be considered if the network provider can demonstrate to the satisfaction of the designated official that each of the encouraged options have been evaluated and eliminated. So I personally hate that because it puts city staff at like this discretionary spot of saying, yeah, they convinced me, right? I mean, this is that vague kind of language, and I'm not being critical of Daniel. I think he was trying to negotiate something with the carriers, but as staff, this is one of those, give me boxes I can check, and I don't mean to say that we're that blunt at the city, but this puts the city in a place where I can see us getting either contested by a carrier because maybe what they brought us we don't agree with, but we don't agree with it for maybe some kind of light reasons, and having to try and, I always think about things in terms of applicants appealing decisions, right? And so if we've denied something and they appeal that to the hearing examiner, I now have to go defend why we denied it. And this is the only thing I'm going to point at, and this doesn't feel really good for me as someone who wants to not be discretionary, because I think when the city is discretionary, we put ourselves in a bad spot. So this is where it is right now, Vicki. If everybody says this language is great, if they say it's great and our attorney says it's great, then this is probably what it'll be. But I'll just tell you my 2 cents is this kind of worries me a little bit. So
what's the path forward there? If we agree with you and say we'd like more boxes that can be checked and more detail in that.
So then we ask our attorney to work on version 2.0 to get incorporated into the version that goes to council that would be less discretionary.
So would that have to come back to us after that, or would it be something where we would say, we want this?
I'm comfortable with, if you guys say we'd like for you to, Wes is going to get me, sorry. I mean, if you give us clear direction on what you want this, where you want this to go, I would look to Daniel to tell me if we have to have another hearing if this changes. I don't know that it necessarily would have to come back to PPC. That hearing could happen at the council. There might be some other changes that they make as it goes through committee.
So I'll just touch on that real quick. I think that the likelihood that there's going to be a change large enough to warrant another hearing is that likely will happen at some point in this process. That's not a given, though. So we'll just have to see where the changes end up and whether a hearing and whether that's going to be in front of council. On this language, I would say that generally speaking, I agree with Keith. This is not ideal. The idea here was to get the city and the proponent talking and to try to figure out a solution. go through everything in encouraged and talk about why you can't be there, and likely at the end of it, they will have some sort of resolution. Having something that you can have definable boxes to check would be way better, particularly for the appeal process. Because, and I noted this when I sent it over, if the designated official does say no all the way till the end, could somebody say that's been an arbitrary decision? And so, like, I totally get that. I would say that I have not heard of another solution that really works, and that doesn't mean that we can't find one and make one. But if we're looking for check boxes, you'd have to look at the encouraged column and create a checkbox for each one to say, this is how you get away from this element of encouraged. And I think we could do that. I think you say, here are the 4 boxes, one for each, or however many there are, under encouraged. If you're not going to do this, you need to show this. I think that there is probably some concern from industry that there are things that may come up that the city wouldn't necessarily have the expertise. And so industry is just going to say something, and how would you know? And that has no knock on city staff at all. They just may know better whether or not those sites are going to be feasible. So this is a challenging one, and would certainly say moving away from this to something different is totally fine. We're just going to need to brainstorm how that's going to work for staff to make sure it's workable and they understand it, but then also that it works in the long run. So.
Okay. Well, so why I brought it up, I think, is similar to what Keith expressed, because in the previous version, there was a technical evaluation, which I think, to me, means some more specific boxes or some more specific information to fill in. And I think that it would be good to be clear about what they need to show to demonstrate why they need to put this pole in front of somebody's house, for example, and that sort of thing. So I think maybe, in my opinion, going back towards the direction of a technical evaluation would be what I would be more comfortable with. And then I have a few other comments. So on Front Street, the more I hear about these small cells, the more ideas come up, like the small cell on the blinking walk towers and on different building configurations. And so I am in favor of keeping the prohibit on Front Street, because I think that as the technology develops, there will be more and more creative options, and this is all about poles. And I would like to see our Front Street maintained the way it is and its historic nature, and I think that there will be increasingly creative ways to do that, and so I would like to make changes as that becomes more appropriate. And I appreciated that the promptly was defined for safety. That was one concern I had. I am, however, not sure if 48 hours is prompt for a safety issue, especially because it says or secure the facilities, so I can understand it might take a while to remove it, but especially to secure it, I think I would have hoped that that they have a policy that if there's a safety issue, they send somebody out as soon as they get the call. That would be my hope for safety. And I also appreciated the change that it can be either the designated official or the carrier that decides if something is obsolete or damaged. And then my last comment is about the Squaw Mountain poles. I think that they are a good example probably of poles where if somebody put, some of these poles, if somebody put something on top, I don't know that anybody would notice. But I also, in the very long term, I sort of have this vision of having undergrounded utilities, and adding poles for things is contrary to that, and sticking things on poles is also contrary to that. So I would just like to keep that in mind, and I think that that also speaks to the co-location, so that if we have this, if I have this ultimate dream of undergrounding things, then if we have fewer poles to take stuff, take equipment off of, that kind of would assist with that. So I'm also in favor of the co-location, although perhaps with some modifications as needed.
So Keith, on that idea, those poles on Squawk are PSC owned, right?
Yes.
Okay, so if they decided to underground, it would be up to them to negotiate with the carriers on something like that. We don't have anything where we would have carriers coming onto a municipal pole that we would then want to underground, do we?
So,
Because we've said no municipal poles.
so Vicky's brought up an interesting, you guys are spooling on an interesting thing that I hadn't thought about. So here we go, we've got these things, and not all of them have a street light on them. Some of them are just overhead power poles, right? And so if they go in, let's say there's no Cobra head on this and it's just a power pole, and they go in and they put an antenna up at the top. If this property owner was going to, let's say that they're going to now bulldoze their existing house and put in a duplex. What the city code would say is you have to underground the power along your street frontage. All right, so now all of a sudden, you've got this antenna up here, and they're going to now underground this from here, and this one's actually coming out of the ground. That's what that PVC is it's coming out from underground to this pole. But it would go then to the next pole underground. So you would, at the end of that project, you would have you'd have your cable and your power underground, but they would have to install a new pole for the antenna. And it would probably be, I would assume, at the expense of the provider. I don't know. I mean, we're in a weird place that I haven't really thought much about. But so what would happen is this wooden pole goes away. There's a new pole that's probably about this tall that has an antenna on top of it that's metal and has like a box at the base. Okay. But that's what would happen. Now, on this particular one, so this one's a little funky. It's hard for me to tell. This one might have it might be a higher power overhead pole. So we require undergrounding of the most basic electric, but once it gets above a certain point, it gets kind of cost prohibitive to put it underground because you actually have to cool it. So for this one with the street light, it would basically, this thing would go away and there'd just be a street light with an antenna on top of it. That's the outcome if this guy ever redeveloped his property.
So the owner of the pole can make that decision that they want to put in a smaller pole?
So the owner of the pole, so right now maybe I was not clear. So PSE likes their poles, so they generally don't trade them out. But if this was a redevelopment project, it would go undergrounded, and that would be a city requirement. So the replacement pole would be, in this particular case, because of the light standard, it would still be a PSE pole with an antenna on top of it, most likely.
So if that property redeveloped, PSE would be required to put in a new pole after the rest of the electric is undergrounded?
So the electric would go underground because that's a requirement of the city.
Yep.
And then assuming we still wanted a street light here, maybe it's serving a purpose, the developer would pay PSE to put in a new overhead streetlight pole to replace the wooden one. So it'd be a metal one, and it would likely not be that tall. And then they would put an antenna on top of it. Oh, and Daniel wants to say something.
Sit down.
Oftentimes as well, if there wasn't the light on that pole and the primary purpose of the pole was electrical and that goes away, a lot of times that pole would go away, and the franchise agreement that the carrier has with the city to go into the right-of-way would say that if the primary purpose of that pole no longer exists, you have to leave that pole, and then they would have to find another location. Sometimes it just depends on how that language is, but there is a franchise agreement to be in the right-of-way that would address likely this circumstance.
Anything else? So I had this long list of questions which have already been answered.
Sweet.
So it's easy. There were just, I appreciate the fact that the carriers and the city got together and worked this out, and it was negotiating and reasonable, and I think it worked out for both sides. But I don't think that putting it on paper, you're going to find every instance that is going to happen. And so there's always going to be, as my neighbor here said, a crystal ball. We can't get in there and see what problems are going to exist or where they're going to come from or how we like something or whatever. So I know there were a couple little issues in the way of safety that I would love to have it fine-tuned a little bit. And there was, we're not attorneys, and so I'm comfortable with, the end result is going to be the same, it's just how the attorney is going to be able to put it into words and make sure it works. Was there anything else that, besides those two issues that?
There was one, so I'm going through my list. I used my phone to take notes tonight. The single family for macro. And Troy kind of brought up, well, what about, if it was a non-single family use? And I guess the question for you all is, right now we have a prohibition for single family. We can either leave that as is, or we can go back in and say, basically that a single family use cannot have a macro tower on it, but a non-single family use in a single family zone could. It might be, I'm sure it'll be more elegant than that.
Yeah,
but
yeah, and I was just, because right now you can do macro in single family.
You can.
Right now.
But so part of this is.
I was just trying to split the difference a little bit.
Part of this is when 505 was written, and this was, so we're in the same place we were with macros. Hey, it's coming. They're going to, who knows, we didn't know how many macro towers we were going to have in our city. The worst case, we were going to have like 100, and it's like, oh my gosh, and, we just didn't know. And so what ended up happening is, right now, I think what we've heard from most of them, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, is they have coverage in our city. This is about capacity. So the addition of macros, will be to add both coverage and capacity. So new macro facilities might be needed. There is a relationship between the small cell and the macro cells. And so, so they could need additional macro towers in the city. I don't think they know that yet. I have not heard them tell us that they're planning more macro towers in Issaquah right now. And so, and unfortunately, we don't have something like a conditional use process where you could allow it via conditional use, which is an extra added, public notice, and you make sure that everybody gets a chance to say, oh my gosh, this is horrible. So it's kind of either we allow it because it's allowed now, or we dial it back and say, you know what, if they have to add some more macro facilities, maybe when they know that they've got one and it can't go anywhere but in a single family zone, maybe at that point we change the code. I don't know. I mean, you could go either direction. It depends on how kind of restrictive you want to be right now.
So we have to have a motion tonight to approve what the city has presented with the changes and the changes that we spoke about tonight. And I understand that there's going to be changes. There's going to be problems. There's going to be questions during the year. Can we put it on the schedule so in a year, 18 months, that it comes back to us so that we can review it at that time?
Sure.
I mean, I assume there's going to be some things that are going on, and I think it would be nice for the carriers to know that we are in the process of looking at it, and we would come back and discuss it and see if there's any problems.
Along those lines, do we have a group of permits sitting in a basket someplace down waiting for this decision to be made, or is this just for, we're thinking this might happen in the next 6 months, we're going to come to you guys with 10.
So.
Or it might be a year from now when we finally get all our design work done, and reviewing this in a year might not be worthwhile because nothing has happened.
So I think we expect there will be permits in place in a year. So right now, Verizon has their franchise agreement for Issaquah, Pine Lake, Issaquah, Falls City. So that's the first application that got grandfathered in because these weren't in place. AT&T had come in for kind of a pre-app, and then they kind of backed off. I don't know what's going on with them. And I don't mean that in a bad way, sorry. That didn't come out very good. Cold medicine's wearing off. So that they'll be back. And Verizon has already said their next deployment, I believe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, is East Lake Sammamish Parkway.
Don't actually know which one may be next.
Okay, so they've got a few queued up, and I haven't heard from Sprint.
Okay, I just.
Paul hasn't come in yet. I assume they're coming in at some point too. And T-Mobile, I'm not sure where they are in looking at Issaquah. Obviously, they participated in the last meeting, but I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think in a year from now, I would expect we would actually have gotten some mileage out of this code.
Okay.
Okay. So my only concern with the whole thing is to have 6 or 7 different carriers with 6 or 7 different poles everywhere in the city. Although I did drive down SR 900 next to the transit station, and there are a lot of poles on both sides. And, after a while, you don't even notice them. And they were, they're attractive, they're nice, they weren't derogatory to the scenery. So maybe that's our future. So with that, are you ready to vote on this?
Well, we're going to eliminate, or are we
So we're gonna-
eliminating the contiguous 500 in the gap and just going with 5? Everybody's agreeing to that?
Yeah.
So what I heard was you guys are going to get rid of the 500 feet for contiguous, and you also would like the city attorney to continue to work on the technical evaluation piece to have it be a little bit more predictable, less discretionary for staff.
And safety. I think 48 hours is a little bit much, if you could sort of shrink that down.
Do you guys have a suggestion on promptly if there's an emergency technical issue, something?
Not to remove it, but
Right, to dial it down.
to
Secure it.
eliminate the,
Yes, absolutely. More than happy to sit down.
nothing is normal.
Kim Allen for Verizon. Each of the small cells has a power disconnect on it, where anyone, if there was a pole strike, you can shut off our equipment. So our equipment is not live or active in the event that you have something like that happen. Certainly, we know right away. An alarm goes off at Verizon if there's something that happens to that equipment, and we would dispatch someone. 24 hours if possible, that sounds, Jennifer? I'd have to go back to Verizon and see if that's what's feasible and what's possible. I know we'd head out there as soon as we could.
They have a number you can call in case of emergency, I just don't know what their timeline is.
Yeah.
When they get notice to they have someone on call at all times.
Yeah. I can get you that information, Keith.
If it's possible, if whatever, but I think it is a concern, so.
Okay, so the third one would be, we will look at trying to narrow that window from 48 hours to something less.
Yeah.
But we'll make sure that the carriers are okay with where we're at. Okay?
My other concern is still the 45-foot poles. I don't know if there's anything that we can do about that, but the idea of a lot of 45-foot poles down Gilman Boulevard or anything, I still have a little bit of a problem with that.
So some of this is going to be, and to Joan's point earlier, I mean, in a way, all of our streetscapes are getting filled with things. And right now, Issaquah has prided itself on keeping our sign code really tight so that we don't have a ton of signs. I mean, I think one of the things that's nice about this community is our streetscapes are fairly uncluttered. And I hate to say that there might just need to be a couple canaries before we decide whether, 45 feet's the wrong number. I mean, so if they end up going down East Lake Sammamish and we see a bunch of 45-foot tall new poles because they can't convince the city to put them on top of their poles, then maybe that either changes the prohibition on municipal poles, or maybe we decide that, we'll roll the dice against co-location and maximize the pole height at 30 feet or at 25 feet. So I think, I hate to say that we're might have to test drive it a little bit, which goes maybe back to Joan's suggestion earlier. Let's look at this in a year. Let's take some photos of the streetscape and see what it actually looks like in the field. And then if we feel like we might have drawn the line in the wrong space, we can maybe retool.
Okay.
Anybody else? You got
Go ahead.
nothing else? In that case, I move we recommend the city council approve the proposed code amendments to IMC 18.07.505 as presented this evening, and as we have talked about amending with consideration of the testimony provided both in writing and before the Planning Policy Commission.
Second.
A second?
Second.
Any more discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. So, anything else that you guys want to talk about? No?
Next Thursday, we're in the Eagle Room, which I'm pointing in the right direction, in the police station.
Some of us are in the Eagle Room.
Some of us are not, that's true. Some of us are not in the Eagle Room, but this group is in the Eagle Room with the park board and the task force talking about the green necklace and the visions. Your packet will be mailed out tomorrow because we're just
Okay, in the
rolling
next-
stuff around.
I know that we have scheduled every Thursday for the month of February. I just hope that you all can come because we want to finish this vision process, and hopefully we only need one meeting with Parks so that we can spend the time we need on the vision. One other thing that I want to say is I hope you all fill out your applications.
And on the visions, you guys don't care, but on the visions, if you guys, I would assume, is there a value to get them like earlier than just the week before the next PPC meeting?
For the 15th, you mean?
Yeah.
The next one?
Because we could probably get them
be the
to you
next
next
one.
week. So my goal would be for the beginning of the story to not actually talk about that anymore, but to have you guys just redline. So now we're down to like wordsmithing, right? And that would be better for you guys to do and just send me back scribbles, and I can incorporate those. That's pretty easy. But to have us spend our times actually on the neighborhoods, because that's really where we need to get to.
Right.
So if that would be helpful for us to get that to you so you can start going through that and redlining earlier, we could probably get that to you this week, next week.
Yeah, this week's almost over, but.
Yeah, sorry,
we could.
I'm a little bit
Because that would be the
detached.
15th. On the 15th, it's totally on the visions again, not the green necklace.
What's the one next week then?
The green necklace with the park board. That's the 8th.
Where the,
On the back, I'm putting in a gen on, because it keeps changing, so I'm trying to keep the schedule up to date.
I would like to keep the 28th to have a review of all of the pieces that we've gone over. Not to discuss them, but just to make sure that these are the high points and this is how it fits into the vision. Do we need so many parking spaces? Do we need whatever to meet what we've created in the vision? So that is what I would like on that.
On the
That's-
28th.
That's the day that we're supposed to sign off on the vision. I would
Right.
like to make sure we have that.
Okay. Okay. And I'll mention to Parks that we're hoping to either not have to meet with them on the 22nd or meet very shortly with them on the 22nd. We're hoping to wrap everything up with them, with the Park Board on the 8th.
Basically, all we need is the general better idea of where the green network is going to go.
Right.
We don't have to know the implications of the various neighborhoods or the reason why it was put together, because it might change.
Right.
But we just wanted to have something more than the necklace with green balls that was
Right.
in there. So.
Right. We'll do our best to get the
Okay.
time scheduled.
Okay. So with that, hearing nothing for the good of the order, I close the meeting at 8:11. Thank you.